They laughed when they saw it for the first time. To experienced German tank crews, the American M4 Sherman did not look like a serious weapon of war. It was tall, box-shaped, and lightly armored compared to the machines they trusted. These were men who had survived years of armored combat across Europe and the Soviet Union. They had fought in Poland and France. They had battled Soviet tanks in brutal conditions on the Eastern Front. They believed they understood tank warfare better than anyone. When the Sherman appeared, many of them dismissed it instantly. Early encounters reinforced that belief. In North Africa, and later in Italy, German gunners found the Sherman easy to identify and easy to hit. Its high silhouette stood out on the battlefield. Its armor could be penetrated by German guns at ranges where the Sherman struggled to respond. Panzer crews compared it to their own tanks and saw no contest. The Panzer IV, and later the Panther and Tiger, carried heavier guns, stronger armor, and superior optics. At long distances, German crews often fired first and destroyed their targets with deadly accuracy. Combat reports written after these early battles sounded confident and dismissive. German officers described the Sherman as poorly protected and undergunned. Some referred to American crews as inexperienced and overly cautious. Tankers joked that one solid hit was enough to set the Sherman on fire. They believed American industry had sacrificed quality for speed, producing a tank that looked impressive in numbers but weak in combat. From their perspective, the evidence seemed clear. There was truth behind the confidence. In many early engagements, German tanks destroyed Shermans quickly and efficiently. A well-positioned Panther or Tiger could knock out multiple American tanks in a single fight. Burning Shermans littered the battlefield. Smoke rose from wrecked hulls. Crews scrambled to escape, while German gunners calmly searched for the next target. Each destroyed tank reinforced the belief that the Sherman was no match for German armor. But this confidence rested on a dangerous assumption. German tank doctrine focused on winning individual battles through superior firepower and training. Destroy the enemy. Break his force. Move on. That approach had worked before. Yet the Sherman was not designed for the kind of war German crews were expecting. While they judged it only by armor thickness and gun caliber, they failed to understand the larger system behind it. In the early battles, the Sherman seemed fragile and flawed. But what German crews did not yet realize was that the tank they mocked was only the beginning. The nickname spread quickly through German units. They called the Sherman a lighter. A tank that burned the moment it was hit. Stories moved from crew to crew and grew darker with every retelling a single penetration, flames inside the fighting compartment, and ammunition cooking off. Crews trapped with no time to escape. For German tankers who took pride in survival and discipline, this confirmed everything they believed about the American machine. German intelligence officers collected battlefield reports and drew firm conclusions. The Sherman's armor was thinner than expected. Its ammunition storage was vulnerable. Its gasoline engine worried them. Compared to the diesel engines used in many German and Soviet tanks, gasoline seemed dangerous. The reputation of the Sherman as a death trap took shape long before American forces fully entered Western Europe. By the time Normandy approached, many German crews believed they already knew how the fight would go. These beliefs shaped German tactics. Panther and Tiger crews were trained to engage Shermans from long range. They waited in concealed positions. They chose hold-down terrain. They trusted their optics and gunnery skills. When Shermans appeared, they were treated as easy prey rather than a serious threat. German gunners aimed carefully, fired once, and expected the fight to be over. Often it was. The reputation followed the Sherman into France. As Allied forces pushed inland after D-Day, German tankers watched American units advance with confidence. They expected high losses. They expected fear and hesitation. In the early weeks, those expectations seemed correct. Shermans burned in the hedgerows. Crews learned quickly how vulnerable they were to well-placed German guns. The old stories from North Africa and Italy appeared to repeat themselves. But the reputation hid an uncomfortable truth. German losses were becoming harder to replace. Every Panther destroyed mattered. Every Tiger lost was a serious blow. These tanks required skilled labor, complex parts, and long repair times. When one was knocked out, it often stayed knocked out. Spare parts were scarce. Fuel was scarcer. Recovery vehicles were under constant attack from Allied aircraft. At the same time, American units behaved in a way German crews did not expect. Shermans did not withdraw after heavy losses. They returned. The same units appeared again days later and sometimes hours later. New tanks arrived with fresh crews. The burned wrecks were pushed aside. The advance continued. German tankers began to notice that destroying Shermans did not stop the pressure. It only delayed it. Still, most German crews clung to the old belief. The Sherman was weak. Numbers alone could not win armored battles. Quality would always defeat quantity. That belief had defined German armored doctrine since the beginning of the war. And abandoning it meant accepting a far more dangerous reality. One they were not yet ready to face. German armored doctrine had been built on a simple idea: fewer tanks and better tanks. Better crews. From the early victories of the war, this belief seemed proved. In France, in the opening stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union, German Panzer units shattered larger enemy forces through coordination, training, and superior firepower. Each tank crew was expected to think independently, react quickly, and destroy multiple enemy vehicles before being threatened themselves. This mindset shaped how German tankers judged every opponent they faced. Against this standard, the Sherman appeared unimpressive. It was not designed to dominate a battlefield alone. It was not meant to outgun the heaviest enemy tanks. German crews measured strength in armor thickness and gun caliber, and by those measures, the Sherman fell short. When Panthers and Tigers entered service, the contrast seemed even sharper. These machines were purpose-built killers, designed to destroy enemy armor at long range and survive return fire. German tankers believed this technological edge would decide the war in the West. What they failed to recognize was that the Americans were fighting a different kind of war. The United States did not expect one tank to defeat all others. The Sherman was part of a system. It was meant to work with infantry, artillery, engineers, and aircraft. It was designed to move fast, communicate by radio, and stay in the fight. Most importantly, it was designed to be produced in enormous numbers without slowing down. While German factories struggled with bombing raids, shortages, and complex designs, American factories operated far from the front lines. Assembly lines ran continuously. Parts were standardized. Damaged tanks could be repaired quickly or replaced entirely. To American planners, a tank that could be built fast and shipped across oceans was more valuable than one that took months to produce and weeks to repair. On the battlefield, this difference began to show in subtle ways. German units held strong defensive positions and waited for the enemy to appear. They destroyed the first wave of Shermans and expected the attack to collapse. Instead, the pressure continued. American forces adapted quickly. They used smoke. They maneuvered around strongpoints. They called in artillery. When tanks were lost, others took their place. The attack did not stop. German tank crews noticed that American units did not retreat the way earlier enemies had. Losses did not break their momentum. Even when a position was held successfully, the situation often worsened hours later. New Shermans arrived. Infantry followed closely behind. Supply trucks rolled forward. German crews began to fight the same battles again and again, with fewer resources each time. Still, many clung to their original belief. The Sherman was flawed. The Americans were wasting tanks. Eventually, they would run out. This assumption allowed German crews to hold on to confidence even as the strategic situation deteriorated. But beneath that confidence, a troubling pattern was forming, and one that would soon become impossible to ignore. The turning point did not come from a single battle or a dramatic breakthrough. It came from repetition. German tank crews began to notice that no matter how many Shermans they destroyed, the battlefield never seemed to empty. In Italy, in France, and later across Western Europe, the same pattern repeated itself. A German unit would engage an American armored force. They would knock out several Shermans, and sometimes many. And yet, the pressure did not ease. Instead, it intensified. American commanders expected losses. They planned for them. Shermans were pushed forward with the understanding that some would not return. When a tank was destroyed, the crew was often replaced within days. When a unit suffered heavy losses, replacements arrived quickly. The American system was built to absorb damage and keep moving. German crews were not used to facing an enemy who could take punishment and continue the attack without pause. Behind every Sherman on the battlefield stood an enormous logistical network. Fuel depots were established as the front moved forward. Spare parts were stockpiled in vast quantities. Recovery vehicles worked under fire to retrieve damaged tanks. Mechanics labored day and night to return vehicles to service. If a tank could not be repaired, another was already on its way. This was not chance. It was planning on an industrial scale. German tank units lived in a very different reality. Fuel shortages limited movement. Spare parts were rare. A broken transmission or damaged gun could sideline a tank for weeks. Allied aircraft hunted supply columns and repair units relentlessly. Even a tank that survived combat could be lost to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. Each loss reduced combat power in a way that could not be easily repaired. On the battlefield, this imbalance began to wear down even the most experienced crews. German gunners still destroyed Shermans with skill and precision. But every engagement demanded more effort. Flanks were threatened more quickly. Infantry support arrived faster. Artillery fire became heavier and more accurate. German tanks found themselves fighting not just other tanks, but an entire system designed to overwhelm them. The realization came slowly and uneasily. German crews were winning individual fights, but losing something larger. Each battle cost them strength they could not replace. Each destroyed Sherman was replaced by another, sometimes by many others. The battlefield no longer rewarded perfection. It rewarded endurance. And endurance was something the German armored force no longer possessed. As the fighting continued, German tank crews began to feel the weight of exhaustion. Not just physical exhaustion, but mental strain. Every engagement demanded total focus. Every mistake meant destruction. They knew their tanks were powerful, but they also knew how rare they had become. Each loss was permanent. Each breakdown felt like a sentence passed. The pressure to perform perfectly, every time, grew unbearable. American forces, by contrast, fought with a different mindset. Sherman crews expected to take losses and still continue forward. Units rotated more often. Crews received replacements and rest. New tanks arrived with improved features, better ammunition storage, and reinforced armor. Problems identified in early battles were addressed quickly. The Sherman evolved while the war continued. German tanks, though formidable, changed slowly and at great cost. On the battlefield, the nature of combat shifted. German tanks could no longer choose ideal positions and wait patiently. American artillery forced them to move. Fighter bombers attacked from above. Infantry advanced with anti-tank weapons and radio support. Shermans closed in from multiple directions, not to win a duel, but to fix German tanks in place while other weapons destroyed them. The fight was no longer tank against tank. It was system against system. German crews noticed another disturbing change. American units communicated constantly. Radios crackled in every Sherman. Movements were coordinated quickly. When one tank was hit, others reacted immediately. Smoke screens appeared. Flanking maneuvers followed. The battlefield felt crowded and alive in a way it had not before. German crews were no longer hunting. They were being hunted. By late 1944, the imbalance was impossible to ignore. German tankers fought bravely, often destroying many Shermans in a single engagement. Yet when the smoke cleared, the Americans still advanced. Roads filled with fresh vehicles. Damaged tanks were pulled aside. New units took their place. German crews realized that firepower alone could not stop what was coming. The Sherman had never needed to be the best tank on the field. It only needed to stay in the fight. And it did again and again. Each wave pressed harder than the last. The mocking laughter of earlier years was gone. In its place was a grim understanding. This was a war they could no longer win by skill alone. By this stage of the war, German tank crews were fighting against time itself. Fuel shortages dictated when and where they could move. Orders often arrived too late, or could not be carried out at all. Tanks were hidden not for ambush, but to conserve fuel. Crews waited in silence, listening to distant engines and artillery, knowing that once they engaged, there might be no chance to withdraw. Every battle was a gamble with no margin for error. American pressure never truly stopped. Even at night, movement continued. Supply trucks rolled forward. Engineers repaired bridges and roads with speed the Germans could not match. When dawn came, Shermans were already in position, supported by infantry and artillery. German crews began to realize that they were no longer dictating the pace of combat. They were reacting to it. The initiative had shifted completely. Logistics became the silent killer of German armored power. A Panther with no fuel was useless. A Tiger waiting for spare parts was little more than a steel bunker. Recovery vehicles were destroyed by air attacks before they could reach damaged tanks. Crews were sometimes ordered to abandon vehicles that could have been repaired, simply because towing them was too dangerous. Each abandoned tank was another wound that never healed. Meanwhile, American replacement rates remained astonishing. Destroyed Shermans were written off, not mourned. New ones arrived from ports, railheads, and depots with steady rhythm. Crews trained stateside replaced losses with fresh energy. To German tankers, it felt as though they were fighting an enemy that regenerated endlessly. No matter how well they fought, the results never lasted. This reality began to break morale. Veteran crews who had survived years of war felt something new: hopelessness. They could still win battles, but victories no longer changed the outcome. A successful defense meant delaying the Americans for hours, sometimes days, but never stopping them. Each retreat felt heavier than the last, and each new defensive line weaker than the one before. The Sherman, once mocked and dismissed, had become a symbol of this unstoppable advance. Not because it was feared as a weapon, but because it represented something larger: industrial power, organization, and endurance. German crews understood now that they were not fighting a tank. They were fighting an entire nation's ability to wage war. The lesson came too late. The Sherman had never needed to outmatch German tanks one-on-one. It only needed to keep coming. And by the time German crews fully grasped this truth, the endless waves were already upon them. As American forces pushed deeper into Western Europe, the battlefield grew more crowded and more dangerous for German tank crews. Shermans no longer advanced alone. They moved with infantry close at their sides, artillery already registered ahead, and aircraft circling above. German tanks that revealed their positions risked immediate retaliation from multiple directions. Even a successful ambush often triggered a storm of fire that made escape nearly impossible. The presence of Allied air power changed everything. Fighter-bombers roamed freely over roads and open terrain. German crews learned to hide during daylight, moving only at dawn, dusk, or under cloud cover. A single aircraft sighting could force tanks to shut down engines and remain motionless for hours. Meanwhile, American columns continued to move with protection from the sky. The freedom of movement that German armored forces once enjoyed was gone. Sherman units adapted their tactics as well. They avoided direct duels with heavy German tanks when possible. Instead, they fixed them in place. Smoke rounds blinded German gunners. Fast-moving Shermans threatened the flanks. Artillery and air strikes were called in with speed and accuracy. The goal was no longer to prove which tank was superior, but to destroy the enemy by any means available. German crews found themselves trapped in battles they could not control. The psychological strain intensified. German tankers knew they could still destroy Shermans. They had done it many times. But each engagement felt more dangerous than the last. There was no sense of relief after a victory. No feeling of safety. The enemy returned quickly, often stronger than before. Exhaustion set in as crews fought continuously with little rest and fewer supplies. By late 1944, even elite German units felt the change. Experience and skill could no longer compensate for shortages and constant pressure. The battlefield favored coordination and numbers over individual brilliance. German crews who once took pride in outmaneuvering their enemies now fought simply to survive. The war had shifted away from their strengths. The Sherman had become the face of this new reality. Not a perfect tank. Not a terrifying one. But a reliable presence that never seemed to disappear. For German tank crews, the endless appearance of Shermans marked the moment when hope quietly faded. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to delay the inevitable. The change in attitude among German tank crews was subtle at first, but deeply significant. Early in the war, confidence had been their shield. They trusted their machines. They trusted their training. They believed skill would always overcome numbers. Now that belief began to erode. Veterans who had once joked about American tanks spoke differently. Their language became cautious. They no longer talked about victory. They talked about survival. Every destroyed Sherman no longer felt like progress. It felt meaningless. Crews noticed that American attacks did not depend on a single success. If one thrust failed, another followed. If a road was blocked, engineers cleared it. If a bridge was destroyed, a new crossing appeared. German tankers began to understand that the American advance was not fragile. It was flexible. And that flexibility made it dangerous. The psychological toll was heavy. German crews lived with constant tension. Engines were kept off to save fuel. Radios stayed silent to avoid detection. Movements were restricted and cautious. At the same time, American units operated with confidence. Shermans moved openly when air cover was available. Columns advanced steadily, supported by a network that seemed impossible to disrupt. This contrast wore down morale more effectively than enemy fire. German commanders faced impossible choices. Commit tanks and risk losing them permanently. Or hold them back and surrender ground. Every decision carried consequences that could not be undone. Crews sensed this uncertainty from above. Orders became defensive. Withdrawals became frequent. The sense of initiative, once central to German armored warfare, was gone. In this environment, the Sherman's true strength revealed itself. It was not fearsome. It was dependable. It started when needed. It moved when ordered. It fought as part of a larger force that absorbed mistakes and continued forward. German crews came to understand that the Sherman represented something they could no longer counter. A war fought with depth, with reserves and with patience. By the time the Allies pushed toward Germany's borders, the realization was complete. The Sherman had not defeated German tanks through superiority. It had defeated them through persistence. Each wave reduced German strength. Each engagement narrowed their options. The laughter of earlier years had vanished completely, replaced by a quiet dread of what would appear next over the horizon. German tank crews had learned the lesson too late. The Sherman was not meant to win duels. It was meant to win wars. And by enduring when others could not, it had done exactly that. By late 1944 and early 1945, the reality facing German tank crews was impossible to escape. They were outnumbered, undersupplied, and exhausted. Even when German tanks achieved tactical success, the strategic picture never changed. A destroyed Sherman was quickly replaced. A destroyed Panther or Tiger was gone forever. This imbalance defined the final months of the armored war in the West. German crews still fought with determination. Many engagements ended with impressive kill counts. But these victories came at a cost they could no longer afford. Fuel shortages limited movement. Ammunition was rationed. Repairs were improvised or abandoned entirely. Tanks were sometimes destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture, not because they were damaged beyond repair, but because they could not be moved or supplied. American armored units, meanwhile, continued to expand their strength. Supply lines stretched across Europe but remained intact. Ports, railroads, and roads were restored with speed. New Shermans arrived alongside newer variants, better protected and more survivable than earlier models. Losses were absorbed without disrupting the overall advance. The system worked exactly as intended. German commanders recognized the pattern, but there was no solution. The industrial gap was too wide. Allied air power prevented large-scale movement. Defensive lines collapsed under sustained pressure. Tank crews were sent into battle knowing the odds were against them, not because victory was possible, but because delay was necessary. Every hour gained mattered, even if the outcome was certain. The war of attrition reached its final stage. German crews could still win fights, but they could not win time. Every engagement shortened the distance to defeat. The Shermans' presence became constant. Roads, fields, and towns filled with them. Not in reckless charges, but in steady, coordinated advances that never fully stopped. In the end, German tank crews understood the truth that had once seemed unthinkable. Superior machines and skilled crews were not enough. Wars were decided by who could endure the longest. By who could replace losses faster than the enemy? By who could keep moving forward when others were forced to stop. The Sherman had become the embodiment of that endurance, not perfect, not invincible, but relentless. And against that relentlessness, even the most feared German tanks could not prevail. When the fighting finally ended, German tank crews looked back on the war with a bitter understanding. They had not been defeated in the way they once imagined. There was no single battle where their tanks proved inferior in every way. In many engagements they fought with skill and courage until the last moments. Yet none of that had been enough. The outcome had been decided long before the final shots were fired. The Sherman was never meant to be a perfect tank. It was not designed to dominate through armor or firepower alone. Its true strength lay in something far less dramatic but far more powerful. It could be built quickly. It could be shipped across oceans. It could be repaired in the field. And when it was destroyed, it could be replaced without slowing the advance. This was a form of power German tank crews had underestimated from the beginning. For the United States, the Sherman fit perfectly into a broader way of war. It worked alongside infantry, artillery, engineers, and aircraft. It moved with reliable radios and steady logistics. It allowed commanders to accept losses without losing momentum. The tank itself was only one part of a vast system designed to apply continuous pressure until resistance collapsed. German tank crews learned too late that wars are not won by brilliance alone. They are won by endurance, by organization, by the ability to fight not just one battle, but thousands, without breaking. The Sherman proved that a weapon does not need to be feared to be effective. It only needs to be present, again and again, when the enemy can no longer keep up. In the end, the mocking laughter faded into silence. The tank that had once been dismissed became a symbol of inevitability, not because it was the strongest, but because it never stopped coming. And in the long war of machines and men, that was what decided the outcome.